There were people around the studio who were like, you're crazy, this isn't going to work, people are going to hate this. Because what if they lose the player? Uncharted Drake's Fortune, there's the classic video game red barrel in the Jeep, and if you shoot it, the Jeep flips as the explosion happens, and the Jeep now forms a bridge so that you can run forwards. This was emblematic of what Naughty Dog now call in-game cutscenes, where you barely disrupt the main flow of the gameplay, and you do a few clever camera tricks, camera cuts, and get the player right back into the flow of the action to create this feel of playable cinema, which was what Uncharted 2 was all about. And it worked very well. We immediately started coming up with scenarios that would support this kind of thing. The train sequence in Uncharted 2, that afforded a lot of cinematic action and culminating in this big explosive sequence at the end.
Here goes nothing.
For a long time, the mainstream of games arguably overtraded in that high intensity play when we have all of these other styles of gameplay available to us. I always think that it's a bit like having an artist's palette full of colors, and with those different colors you can create really any kind of experience that you want to. And I think that it's oftentimes just having the courage to do it. Game developers were anxious about exploring other styles because what if they lose the player? What if players recoil from either a tonal shift or a shift in the patterns of gameplay and they stop playing the game? It's a bit like the old Spinal Tap thing, if you're at 10, do you have an 11 to go to? The obvious answer to this intensity arc problem is to bring the intensity back down. I think it was probably Amy, Bruce, Neil, and Evan who cooked up this idea. They realized that we needed to do a reset. And I had recently been shown a game called The Graveyard by Tale of Tales. The game is a memento mori. You play an old woman and you're walking down a path through a graveyard towards a bench. Your steps are kind of faltering and the sunlight is playing across the scene and birds land on the tombstones. There's a dog barking in the distance. It doesn't have much in the way of a gameplay that would like grab you and draw you in. It just allows you to focus on the traversal mechanics of the game and what kind of meaning is implicit in them. And I think it's a truism that when there's stuff happening in the avant-garde, there's great potential for those ideas to make their way into the mainstream, to enrich what's happening in the mainstream of any art form. I think the Graveyard kind of uses the meditative pace of walking to shift us into this space of what ultimately becomes a contemplation of mortality in this tradition of Renaissance paintings of memento mori, which are intended to make their audiences humble. In some ways, I think it's the first walking simulator. Don't really like that term, but it's a recognizable one for a first-person narrative game without the mechanics like shooting that were traditional first-person games. It kind of set a light bulb off over my head. Amy and the rest of the crew were discussing the idea for this peaceful village that would then become war-torn. I was like, can I work on the peaceful village level? There's something mindful or meditative in it, I think, in a way that's quite transparent to the player, that's not noticeable to the player. We can really sculpt their emotional experience just with, the tweeting of some birds, the blowing of the wind, the clouds dappled across the landscape. Good design is rooted in good design process. And process was what Naughty Dog had a lot of. it seemed like a kind of a risky thing to do at the time, to have a kind of a sequence with little in the way of core gameplay. And there were people around the studio who were like, you're crazy, this isn't going to work, people are going to hate this. And I was very pleased with the reception it got, because it was commented on a lot. I'm a big believer in allowing players to drive their own experience. You know, we're an interactive art form. We want to engage people's agency as much as we can. And so I think it's a marker of the ongoing maturation of games as an art form, that we now see this kind of emotional tone and the ideas, the almost spiritual ideas, right, that tied up in it. For people, no matter what kind of person they are, whether they're a very action-oriented, goal-getting person, or whether there's someone who needs to tune into a more reflective space, it's helpful to get attuned to their inner lives for a multitude of reasons, to have a little bit of detachment from what's going on and to observe what's going on more clearly, right? Without getting so caught up in the emotion that, you know, it inevitably forms a massive part of all of our lives. I think it's helpful in a variety of ways for us to reflect and to get oriented on what's really going on for us and for others. I think it helps make the world a better place.